Hey everybody, welcome to CIS 17A lesson number 9. So today we're going to cover the last little bit for functions, and I will review the lab as usual. All right, now I noticed one thing, that the reading starts on page 347, and if you go to page 347, that's the section on default arguments, and I actually covered default arguments in the last lesson, so I believe the reason that I did this is because we did not use default arguments in the last lab. However, for today's lab, we are definitely going to have to use default arguments in order to provide a solution to the problem. So I'm not going to review this again. I will just briefly mention that when you put this in the prototype for a function, that makes it so that if the user does not provide an argument here, that it will automatically provide a default setting of 20, and in this case a default setting of 10 to the second argument if the user doesn't provide anything here. And then again, just really quick, you got to make sure that when you use default arguments, that you always place the default arguments to the right of any arguments, I'm sorry, any parameters that are not default parameters or default arguments. So you can't do something like this. You can't have an empty spot. All right, so again, just the easy way to remember it is that whenever you want to use a default argument, you always have to place that to the right of anything that is not a default argument. Okay, so that was just kind of a quick review. All right, the new stuff. So the new stuff is going to start on page 350, and that's going to be reference variables. So a reference variable is when, well, let me say it this way. We know that when we declare a function that that the variables, the parameter variables, only exist during the time that the function is executing. That once the function finishes, all the statements are complete, that those parameter variables are no longer valid, that they go away. So what a reference does is it makes it so that instead of copying a value up to the parameter variable, we're actually referring to another variable. So that's what this is saying in other words. So what does that mean? That means that when we call a function and we pass by reference, that we're going to actually modify the variable that was used in the function call. Now, to make a function, I'm sorry, to make a parameter a reference, you simply put the ampersand symbol in front of the name of the variable inside the parameter and inside the function header. And then that'll make it into a reference variable. So rather than discussing it at length, let's go ahead and just take a look at it, how we would use a reference variable. And before we do that real quick, in the parameter, I'm sorry, in the prototype, you would put the ampersand. You don't, and then optionally you can put a variable name here, but typically people don't. But typically, if you want to make it a reference, you just put the ampersand symbol there. All right, so let's see how a function works using references. Now, one of the handy things about using references is that it's a way of sort of cheating and making a function return more than one value. So we know that by default, when we use a return statement in a function, we can only return one thing. But if we want to try to, say, for example, initialize multiple variables using a function, we would have to do that using references. So let's say, for example, we have two variables here, main number 1 and main number 2, and those are both initialized to the number 1. And we want to overwrite that with some different number. So let's go ahead and first write a prototype for the function. In this case, it's going to return nothing. I'm just going to call the function func, and then put int, because that's what those are down there. Put the ampersand symbol, int, and the ampersand symbol. And that's it. That makes it a function that is going to take two reference variables. So let's go ahead and make this function definition. Okay. So now we do need to give these variables a name. Okay. So now we're going to go ahead and just change them into something else. Let's make one of them equal to 10 and the other one equal to 10. Okay. So just so we can see the whole function. That's all it is, 2 lines of code. And then up here, let's go ahead and call the function and pass it two variables that we put here. So num1, pass that as the first argument, and then num2 as the second argument. Okay. All right, so what should happen is if we didn't call the function, it should obviously just print out 1, 1. So let's see if it does that. Okay, 1, 1. Now let's go ahead and call the function, passing those as references. So we're passing this and this, and then it's going to jump down here and assign these each the value of 10, but these are now references to the variables here. So now what should happen is after we get done calling the function, it should print out 10, 10. Like that. Okay, so that's the difference between a value parameter and a reference parameter, or calling by value versus calling by reference. All right, so that's basically it. So hopefully that makes sense to you guys. Let's go ahead and move on. See if there's anything. Okay, yeah, they mentioned that you can do this instead of this, but this is by far the more common way of doing it in the prototype. Let's see what else. Okay, I'll let you guys go through these examples. Yes. So when you declare that the parameter is a reference, you can't do this. You can't pass a literal to the function. You have to actually pass in a variable that this will be referring to. There's no way for you to reference a literal. So when you do pass by a reference, you can't do this or this. It has to be an actual variable in the argument. All right, next, overloading functions. Overloading functions is when two functions have the same name, but they have a different parameter list. So, and that's really it. So, for example, let's say that you wrote a function called square that will take a number and square it, multiply it by itself, in other words. It may be that you want to pass it an integer, or it may be that you want to pass it a double or a float. So you would just simply write two different functions with the same name, but one in its parameter list would have a double as its argument, and the other one would have integers as its argument. So it would look something like this. The functions have the same name, square and square, but one takes an int, one takes a double. This is an example of overloading a function, or function overloading. All right, and then what will happen is based on whatever you pass to the function call, it will automatically call the correct function. So here we have a double called user float. So when we call square here, it'll automatically know to use the one that uses a double instead of the one that uses int. So function overloading, as easy as that. So you have one here that uses int, the other here that uses double. Again, just note that they have the same name. So that's called function overloading. All right, so let's take a look at a way that we could do that. So let's see. Let's go ahead and go over here. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and have one function that is taking an integer, another function that is going to take a float. They have the exact same name. And then down here, we're just going to go ahead and do a cout statement to show which function we're in. All right. Now let's go ahead and copy this function and paste it back in here, but this time we'll make it a float. Okay, so that's overloaded two overloaded functions. Now let's go ahead and call the function. First time, let's go ahead and use an int. Okay, let's see what happens. It says that this is the int version of func, like we thought it would. Now let's go ahead and change this from an integer to a float. And call it again, or run the function again, run the program again. And I can see this time it called the float version of func. So that's an example of function overloading. All right. Let's see. I don't know. Yeah, that was the last topic for the assigned reading, was to do function overloading. Okay, so not a lot to do in terms of the reading part of this lesson. Okay, let's go ahead and look at the lab now, because the lab is pretty ambitious. It's probably it's the longest program that I've had asked you guys to write so far. So what does this program do? Let's go ahead and just take a look at a couple of example runs. So it is going to ask the person how many numbers they want to add up. And they can add between 2 and 4 numbers up. Next, it's going to ask if they want to add up integers or do they want to add up floating point numbers. So they enter 1 for integer, 2 for floating point. So this person selected 2 that they would like to add up floating point numbers. And they said that they want to add up 3 floating point numbers. So the next thing the program will do is it will ask them for the first number, the second and third number. So the user provides these numbers here. And then it runs off and it says the sum of the numbers is 15.9 in this case. And that's it. All right, so let's go ahead and just look at another run that's with different numbers. So this one asks the person wants to add up 2 numbers. This time they want to add up integers. So the program asks them what's the first number. They put 4. What's the second number? 7. And then the program figures out that 7 plus 4 is equal to 11. So how are these programs going to work? So rather than reading through all of this, I'm going to go ahead and just show you some code on how to get this program to work. As you can see, like I said, this is a rather long program. So let's start off here in main and let's forget about these function prototypes for now. Let's just go ahead and see what it's going to do. All right, so first off, we have 2 variables. One that represents how many things one that represents whether it's floating point or, wait, is that right? No, that's what I thought. Okay, so yeah, choice is the number of numbers that they want to add up. So they want to add up 2, 3, or 4 numbers. And then type choice is whether they want to use integers or floating point numbers to add up. So you're going to write a function called getChoice, and you're going to use reference variables to initialize both of these values inside the same function. So we can see that getChoice, here's the prototype for it, uses 2 reference variables to initialize these 2 variables here. So if we look down at the code for getChoice, you can see that's all we're doing is we're going to ask the person for how many numbers they want to add up. We know that that has to be a number between 2 and 4. So you're going to use a do while loop here, like you've done in previous assignments, to force the person to enter a number between 2 and 4. And then here they are going to enter 1 for integers, 2 for floating point numbers. So same thing, use a do while loop and then just continue to loop until the person puts numbers 1 or 2 to initialize these. All right, so let's go back up here. So that function is going to initialize the 2 variables here. And then the next thing we're going to do is put out 4 variables for floating point numbers and 4 variables for integer numbers. Now we don't know that the person will actually use all 4 of these values, but we're going to declare 4 anyways. Next, we look for what type of numbers that they wanted to add up. Did they put 1 for integers or 2 for floating point? So it's an if-else. If 1, they want to add up integers, else they wanted to add up floating point numbers. And we know that this number is going to be 1 or 2 because we validated it using the do while loop inside the function call, or inside the function. Okay, so next we're going to call another function called setNumbers. And you're going to pass it a reference to the 4 variables here or here, depending on whether they chose integer or floating point. Okay, and then the last number represents, the last parameter, I should say, represents how many of these need to be initialized. Is it 2, 3, or 4? All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at the, oh, and then note that it's using function overloading. So We have one that have one function called set numbers for int, one called set numbers for float. So this is an example of function overloading. Okay, next, let's take a look at the code for set numbers. So in here, we're going to initialize, like I said, either 2, 3, or 4 of these variables in the reference list based on the number here. So if the person chose to do 2, we're going to have 2 cout statements and 2 cin statements where we initialize num1, num2. Otherwise, if they chose 3, we're going to have 3 cout statements where you ask the person for enter number 1, enter number 2, enter number 3, where you initialize those. And then the last but not least, the default is that they wanted to do all 4, because if it wasn't 2 or 3, it had to be 4. All right, so hopefully this function makes sense, using references to initialize the numbers that we're going to add up. All right, so that's what we're doing here. Okay, I'm sorry, that's what we're doing here. Okay, next, we're going to come down here. We're going to just print a message saying that the sum of your numbers is. And then again, if they wanted to add up 2 numbers, the next thing we need to do is we need to look to see, was it an integer or floating point? If they wanted to add up 2 numbers that were integers, then we would call a function here inside of this cout statement called sum. Sum is also an overloaded function. One for int, one for float, and it's just going to simply return the sum of the 4 parameters. Notice that it's also using default arguments. It's going to use a default argument of 0 for every single number, which makes the code very simple for the sum function. All it needs to do in the sum function is add up all 4 numbers and return the value. So it doesn't matter how many of the numbers that they wanted to add because it's 0. So if they just wanted to add up 2, it's going to be this number plus 0 plus 0. If they wanted to add up 3, it's going to be 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 0. And we'll still get the correct amount back in the return statement. And then also there's just a little cout statement here saying that it's adding integers. But then you do want to actually return the sum of num1, num2, num3, num4. And that is pretty much it. So the last if, else, if statement is just looking again at how many numbers you want to add up. So did they want to add up 2 numbers? Was it integers? Or was it, I'm sorry, add 2 numbers? Was it an integer or was it floating point? Okay, and then note here that this code is exactly the same as the code up here, except for that you're going to call but instead you're passing it 3. So here when you call sum, you're only going to pass it to num1 and num2, these ones up here. So in this one you would just pass it I num1 and I num2. And down here for choices equal to 3, you pass it I num1, I num2, I num3. Okay, so you're just calling sum with a different number of variables based on the value of choice, whether they wanted to add up 2 things, 3 things, or 4 things. Okay, so hopefully by looking at this code, that helps you out with the lab assignment. And then again, I just will leave it to you to read through here. This just summarizes what you're supposed to be doing for each function call, or for each function. And then this is sort of a summary of what the program is actually doing. Okay, so that is it for lesson number 9. As usual, if you have questions or anything like that, don't hesitate to reach out to me on inbox, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. All right, good luck, and I will talk to you guys again soon.